The morning of October 14, 1944, began the way mornings do in quiet villages. Birds, pale autumn light, the smell of breakfast. In the small German town of Herlingen, a 15-year-old boy stepped off a train just after 6 in the morning and walked toward his family home. His name was Manfred Rommel, and his father had called him back from his anti-aircraft posting a week early. No explanation was given, but sons know things even when fathers say nothing. Erwin Rommel, Field Marshal of the German Reich, the man the British press had nicknamed the Desert Fox, the General Winston Churchill had praised on the floor of the House of Commons as a great commander even while they were still fighting, was sitting at the breakfast table when Manfred arrived. He greeted his son calmly. They ate together. Then they walked out into the garden. Through the bare October trees, Rommel counted 5 trucks, armed men in civilian clothes. He said nothing about them for a moment. Then he told Manfred that 2 generals from Berlin were coming at noon. He said he wasn't sure what they wanted, a new command, perhaps. Maybe the Eastern Front. He was hopeful, he said, but he said it in the way a man speaks when he already knows the answer and is protecting someone he loves from it. In 4 hours, Erwin Rommel would be dead. If this is the kind of history that keeps you awake at night, the kind that asks something of you long after it ends, subscribe to this channel. We do this every week. Now let's go back to the beginning. Erwin Rommel was born in 1891 in Heidenheim, in the Kingdom of Württemberg, the son of a schoolteacher. There was nothing extraordinary about his origins. No military dynasty, no aristocratic lineage, no family connection to the German high command. He came from middle-class stock and would spend his entire career fighting, quietly and not so quietly, against the establishment officers who had all the right names and none of his instincts. He was commissioned as an infantry officer in 1912 and went to war in 1914 with the kind of reckless physical courage that tends to either get young officers killed quickly or turn them into legends. Rommel became a legend. In the mountains of Romania, and then in Italy at Caporetto in 1917, he led assaults that defied the logic of the Western Front. Mobile, fast, improvised, personal. He commanded from the front. He understood terrain the way some men understand music, instinctively, almost physically. At Caporetto, his unit captured over 9,000 Italian soldiers and 150 artillery pieces. He was 26 years old. For that action, he received Germany's highest decoration, the Pour le Mérite. He spent the interwar years teaching, writing, and thinking about movement. His book, Infantry Attacks, published in 1937, was studied at military academies across Europe and quietly in America. He believed in speed, in disruption, in attacking before the enemy could organize a defense. He had no patience for generals who won by weight and slow accumulation. He thought war was a problem to be solved faster than the other man could think. When the Second World War began, he commanded a panzer division in the invasion of France and drove so fast and so far ahead of the main German line that his own headquarters sometimes lost track of him. He was reprimanded for it. He did it again. By the time France fell, the reprimands had been replaced with commendations. Then came Africa. The North African campaign was, in the long accounting of World War II, a secondary theater. The decisive battles were in Russia and later in Normandy. But Africa was where Rommel became something larger than a general. It was where he became a name that both sides spoke differently than they spoke other names. He arrived in Libya in February 1941 with a small German force, the Africa Corps, sent to prop up the collapsing Italian position. His orders were explicitly to hold, to stabilize the line, not to attack. He attacked within days of landing. Within weeks, he had driven the British back hundreds of miles and surrounded the port of Tobruk. He moved at a tempo that British commanders found genuinely disorienting. General Claude Auchinleck, the British commander, issued a remarkable order to his officers. Stop telling your men how good Rommel is. The name was becoming too large, too present in the minds of British soldiers. It was acquiring the weight of myth. Part of that weight came from what Rommel didn't do. The Africa Corps was not accused of the systematic atrocities that marked German conduct in Russia and Eastern Europe. Rommel himself defied at least one direct order from Hitler to execute Jewish prisoners of war. and he generally observed the Geneva Conventions in a conflict where that was far from guaranteed. Historians debate the full picture, and the debate is legitimate. The romanticized image of a clean war in Africa has been challenged, and rightfully so. But the basic record stands. Among senior German commanders of that era, Rommel's conduct toward prisoners was notably different from the norm. Churchill stood before the House of Commons in January 1942, in the dark stretch of the war when everything was going wrong, and said this: "We have a very daring and skillful opponent against us, and may I say across the havoc of war, a great general." That line was extraordinary. A sitting prime minister, at war, praising the enemy commander by name and title, in public, under oath to Parliament. No one in that chamber thought it was strange. That tells you something about the kind of soldier Rommel had become. Rommel called the North African War Krieg ohne Hass, war without hate. Whether that was the full truth of what happened in the desert is contested, but it was what he believed about himself. And for a while, it was what the world believed about him too. By the summer of 1943, the war in Africa was over. The Axis forces had surrendered. Rommel had been flown out weeks earlier, officially for health reasons, unofficially because Berlin didn't want its most famous general captured. He was given command of Army Group B in northern France, tasked with preparing the Atlantic Wall against the inevitable Allied invasion. He walked the beaches. He talked to the engineers. He looked at the terrain and came to a conclusion that put him in direct conflict with his superiors. The invasion had to be stopped on the beach itself, in the first 24 hours, or it could not be stopped at all. Once the Allies had a foothold, once their air power could operate over the beachhead and their logistics could flow, the weight of American industrial production would simply grind the German army into nothing. Rommel had seen enough of what America could produce. He had spent 2 years fighting British forces equipped with American weapons, American trucks, American fuel. He understood the arithmetic. He was overruled. The Panzer Reserves were held back, in accordance with doctrine he believed was suicidal. On June 6, 1944, the Allies landed at Normandy. Rommel was at home in Hurlingen, celebrating his wife Lucie's birthday. He drove back immediately, but the moment he had predicted had already passed. The bridgehead was established. The arithmetic had begun. On July 17, 1944, his staff car was strafed by a British fighter bomber near Liverpool. He was thrown from the vehicle when it crashed. He suffered multiple skull fractures, glass fragments in his face, and damage to his left eye. He was hospitalized and eventually transferred home to Hurlingen to convalesce. 3 days after that crash, on July 20, 1944, Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg placed a briefcase bomb under a table at Hitler's Wolfslair headquarters. The bomb exploded. Hitler survived. What followed was a purge without precedent even within the Nazi state. Thousands were arrested, tortured, interrogated. Names produced names produced names. In the breaking of men under Gestapo interrogation, the name Erwin Rommel surfaced. The precise nature of Rommel's connection to the July plot has never been fully resolved, and honesty requires saying so plainly. What is documented? Several of the conspirators had been in contact with Rommel's staff in the spring of 1944. Rommel himself had grown deeply disillusioned with Hitler by that point. He believed the war was lost and had said so to subordinates. He appears to have known that conversations were happening about removing Hitler from power, though he reportedly opposed assassination specifically, preferring arrest and trial. Some of the conspirators had him informally listed for a senior role in a post-Hitler government. What is not documented? Any act of direct participation by Rommel in the planning of the July 20th attempt. Britannica describes him as someone who agreed with the conspirators that Hitler should be removed from power, but looked on assassination with distaste and took no active part. The Holocaust Encyclopedia notes that his name arose in interrogations, but that it was likely he was not directly involved. What is certain? Under the Gestapo's methods, certainty was not required. His name had been spoken. He was famous enough to be dangerous. And by October 1944, Hitler had decided. Field Marshal Keitel called Rommel's home in early October and asked him to come to Berlin. Rommel, citing his injuries and perhaps a clearer understanding of what Berlin meant, declined. He suggested the generals come to him. They agreed. On the evening of October 13th, a staff officer from the Stuttgart district called to confirm that 2 generals would arrive the next day. Rommel told Manfred, who was home on a brief pass, that it might be about a new assignment, maybe the Eastern Front. But that night, he must have known. Men who have lived as long as Rommel had in proximity to power know when the conversation has shifted. The morning of October 14th moved slowly. Rommel and Manfred walked in the garden. The armed men in the trucks watched from a distance. The talk between father and son was careful, measured, the kind of conversation men have when they are trying to give each other something that will last. Manfred asked whether his father would accept a command on the Eastern Front, if that was what was offered. Rommel took his son's arm. He said, "My dear boy, our enemy in the East is so horrifying that any other matter goes to second place. If the enemy manages to conquer Europe, even temporarily, it would be the end of everything that makes life worth living." That was his answer. He would go, he would serve. He still believed in Germany, even if not in Hitler. Those had become 2 separate things in his mind, though history would spend decades debating whether that separation was coherent or convenient. Generals Wilhelm Burgdorf and Ernst Meisel arrived at noon. Rommel brought them to his study. He had changed into his Africa Corps tunic for the meeting, the uniform of his greatest victories, the campaign that had made him famous. Whether that was a statement of identity or simply the habit of a soldier who knew how to dress for significant moments, no one can say. Burgdorf did most of the talking. Meisel was there largely as a witness. What Burgdorf said was this: Rommel had been implicated in the July plot. The Führer had reviewed the evidence. There were 2 paths. The first was the People's Court, a public trial with all that implied for a man of his profile in that particular moment, before those particular judges. The second was poison provided by the generals themselves. If he chose the second, his family would be protected, his wife would receive her pension, his son would not be arrested. He would receive a state funeral and be honored as a hero who had died of his wounds. Germany would mourn him. His name would be clean. He was given time to think. He didn't need much. He came to find Manfred in another room. He spoke quietly. He said, "I have just had to tell your mother that I shall be dead in a quarter of an hour." He paused. Then he continued, "The house is surrounded and Hitler is charging me with high treason. In view of my services in Africa, I am to have the chance of dying by poison. The 2 generals have brought it with them. It's fatal in 3 seconds. If I accept, none of the usual steps will be taken against my family." Manfred, 15 years old, asked the only question a 15-year-old could ask in that moment. "Can't we defend ourselves?" His father looked at him. "There's no point. It's better for one to die than for all of us to be killed in a shooting affray." He told Manfred he believed they would keep the agreement. It was in their interest. The public execution of Erwin Rommel was something even Hitler understood would cost more than it gained. He asked Manfred to promise silence. He said he had also been ordered to extract that promise, but that he believed in it himself. If a single word came out, the deal was void. He said, "I have to go." He put on his overcoat. He picked up his field marshal's baton. He said goodbye to his wife Lucy. He walked out the front door. Manfred and his father's old adjutant Hermann Aldinger, who had been friends with Rommel since fighting alongside him as infantrymen in the First World War, 26 years earlier, walked with him to the gate. Rommel stopped once to make sure his Dachshund didn't follow. Then he shook hands with Manfred. He shook hands with Aldinger. The villagers of Herrlingen saw him go. He got into the back seat of Burgdorf's car. The 2 generals sat on either side of him. SS Sergeant Heinrich Deuce drove them out of the village and up into the hills. About 15 minutes away, in a wooded area along a quiet road, the car stopped. Burgdorf dismissed Meisel and Deuce, and they walked away. 5 minutes later, Burgdorf gestured for them to return. Deuce noticed that Rommel was slumped in the seat. He was taken to the Wagner Schule Field Hospital. 10 minutes after that, they telephoned Lucy Rommel to tell her that her husband had died. German radio announced that Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had died of complications from the wounds he had sustained in Normandy on July 17th. Hitler declared national mourning. A state funeral was held in Ulm on October 18, 1944. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt delivered the eulogy. The German public wept for a hero. The truth, the guns in the trucks, the generals with the poison, the 15-year-old boy at the gate, was buried alongside him. It didn't stay buried. After the war, Manfred broke his silence. The full account of October 14, 1944, came out in testimony and memoirs. The world learned what had happened in Herrlingen. Manfred Rommel went on to have a long life of public service. He became the Lord Mayor of Stuttgart, a position he held for many years, known for his decency and his commitment to reconciliation. He met with survivors of the war, including veterans from countries his father had fought against. He carried his father's name with care. He died in 2013 at 84. He wrote, after the war, that his father's final hours had taught him something he never forgot. That a man's character is most clearly revealed not in his victories, but in what he does with a quarter of an hour at the end. There is a small memorial stone today on the road outside Herrlingen, marking the spot where Rommel died. It is modest, no grand monument, no triumphal arch, just stone and the words and the quiet of a hillside in Württemberg. What do we make of Erwin Rommel? The question resists a clean answer, and we should resist the temptation to force one. He was a brilliant soldier who served a criminal regime and owed his rise, at least in part, to Hitler's personal favor. The chivalry that his admirers celebrate was real in many documented instances and complicated in others. His resistance to Hitler, in the end, was less about moral conviction than about the judgment that the war was lost. A distinction that matters, even if it doesn't erase everything else. But here is what October 14, 1944 shows us, stripped of ideology. A man was given a choice between his own life and his family's safety, and he chose without hesitation. He walked to the car himself. He shook his son's hand. He did not beg, did not bargain for more time, did not make a scene in the driveway of his own house. He died as he had always commanded, with a kind of cold clarity, ahead of the moment, moving faster than anyone expected. Whether that courage redeems him or merely complicates him is a question each of us has to answer for ourselves. What we can say with certainty is this. On a quiet autumn morning in a small German village, a father told his 15-year-old son that he would be dead in 15 minutes, and then he walked outside and kept his word. Some things about war can only be understood in moments like that one. Not in the strategy rooms, not in the history books, not in the parades. In a garden, in October, in the space between a handshake and a car door closing. That is where the real weight of it lives. If this story stayed with you, and I believe it will, subscribe to this channel, hit the like button, and ring the bell so you never miss what's coming next. Every week we go back to these moments, the ones that don't fit cleanly into any narrative, the ones that ask something of us long after we've finished watching. We'll see you there.